Okay, welcome. Today is Module 3, as we've discussed, and we are going to be covering skin and bones today. And before we get started, let's go ahead and pray. Heavenly Father, we are so thankful for this beautiful day that you provided for us, and we are thankful to be here to learn more about your creation of the human body, a most fascinating structure that you've created. And Lord, we're learning about skins and bones today and what their function is, and we just give you praise and glory for its marvelous design. We thank you, Lord, for your mercy and blessings. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, as we talked about already, we are going to start looking at skin and bones today. And the skin has a name for that system. It's called the Integumentary system. But we just call it skin. It's kind of a long name there for that. But it's basically the system of the skin and what it does. The skin has basically two major layers that we break it down into. The first is the epidermis, and the epidermis is the outer surface of the skin, and it's made up of epithelial tissue, and it sits on top of what we call the dermis. Now, the epidermis is made up of stratified, squamous epithelial tissue. Now, we learned about the tissue types last chapter in module number 2, and so the stratified means there's multiple layers, and the squamous means it's flattened. And the epithelial means it's out there on the skin. Then the other layer just below that is called the dermis. Now the dermis is made up of irregular connective tissue. And remember that irregular, the fibers kind of go every which way. There's not a set pattern. And it's dense, so it's really compact, and there's a lot of things in this layer. And that forms that deeper layer of the skin that we have. Then below the dermis, then we get to what we call the hypodermis sometimes, but usually what we call that is subcutaneous. Cutaneous means the outer surface of the skin, and sub would mean below. So it's subcutaneous tissue. And that's made up of loose connective tissue. And with this layer, it's going to connect the dermis layer to muscle or bone down below that. Now, in the dermis, like I said, there are some layers, and the upper layer is called the papillary layer, and this area is what we call undulating, and so it kind of forms up and down motions with the skin, and it has bumps. So I'm going to draw that here on the board so we kind of have an idea of that, and that's going to be in blue. So the dermis kind of looks, if you looked at it as a cross section, there would be some little segments like this and so forth. That's where the dermis would be in this area, and the epidermis would be above that. So we're just going to put an E for epidermis above that. And there's a reason for this undulation type of surface here, and that is because the epidermis, the tissues that are going to be up in this area on the outer surface of our skin, they are not vascular. They have no blood supply. So they are alive to a certain point. They are the ones that are closer down here, but they start to die as those cells move out further from the dermal layer. And so we have this undulation here because we have a blood supply. I'm going to draw some little teeny arteries in here, and it comes out to these cells, and the blood supply is here. And then the oxygen and the nutrition from this layer of cells here diffuses into these epidermis cells, and therefore they do get some nutrition. But the further away these cells get, as we have these layers here real close to the dermis, and obviously there's more cells here, but as we get out here we start getting a little more flattened and a lot of layers. As we said, it's multiple layers of the epidermis out here, and it will be just filled in all through this area. And as we get out here, there's less and less nutrition that's going to get to those cells, and therefore as they start sloughing off and dying off and flaking off from your outer skin, then they have less oxygen, so they're going to be dying here. And we're going to look at that just a little bit more detail as we move on here. So as we said, this layer is undulating. And the reason is so we get more nutrition. And obviously you can see that here, that if it was flat, then all these cells are getting their nutrition. But if it's flat, but this gives more cells contact with this layer here, and they get more nutrition to that epidermal layer. Okay, and these bumps are called dermal papillae. And then because it is so undulating, like we talked about, the nutrition is going to get out to those epidermal layers. Below the papillary layer is the reticular layer. And if you have your books open, you could turn to figure 3.3 and figure 3.1, and you will see those layers defined there pretty good. And it has them labeled on the picture on figure 3.1. It has the reticular layer, which is under the papillary layer. And the papillary layer is actually the distance from, probably need a black pen here. It would be this kind of level right here. Okay, that would be our papillary layer because we have these undulations going up and down. And then below that would be the retinacular level, down in this level here. And this area is all full of all kinds of things here. RETI, R-E-T-I, in the retinacular, the prefix of that, stands for a network. So there's a network of blood vessels, nerves, glands in this hair follicles, sebaceous glands, little tiny muscles that are going to move those hair follicles as well. And nerves in this dermal layer are, there's quite a few nerves in this area. And we're going to draw nerves in black. And so down in this, let's say that level, this is retinacular level, we would have nerves that are in here, and they do different things. This nerve right here might be for heat and cold. So we get our sensation of heat and cold through our skin. So that when we're feeling hot, we touch something that's hot, we feel that. These little receptors here for heat and cold are going to be stimulated. And then we have some for touch. So that, say this one here is for touch. And we have some for light touch and some for deep pressure. So this one over here might be for deep pressure. So light touch would be something obviously coming very lightly touching. Now, someone very lightly touches you, you can feel that. And then we also have deep pressure. We feel now it's pressure. It's a different sensation that we have. So these are receptors that are down in this reticular area, as well as nerves. Well, we said nerves, I mean veins, arteries that are going to give the blood supply all through this area here, and also some glands. And the receptors there are to sense our surroundings, and then it will send information up to the brain to be interpreted. So there's very a necessity thing there to have these there. There are nerves around the hair follicle, and obviously you can tell that because when you touch the hair very lightly, you feel that, and you just barely touch your hair, and you can feel that receptor is being stimulated, and we can feel touch through that. And it's called a little hair follicle receptor on the hair follicle that will sense that hair when it moves. Now the hair itself is dead tissue. The tissue there is dead. It's not alive, although it does have growth. And but that is actually dead at this point in time. Now that hair follicle also has a little tiny muscle attached to it. Let's go ahead and draw a hair follicle here. Let me do it this way. Let's do kind of a bulb down here, and that bulb is going to be lined with this this blue area here. All right, it's going to be a little indentation there. And we'll have our hair coming out of the surface of the skin, let's say. So this is our little hair follicle down here. And attached to that is kind of light. There's a little muscle attached to that. Okay. They're really, really small, little teeny tiny muscles. As you can imagine, it's down in the skin, but each hair follicle has one attached to it. And what happens is this little muscle, when it's stimulated, will actually pull the hair and makes it move. And why is that important, or when do we see that typically? Well, sometimes when you get cold and the hair, say on your arms or the back of your neck, stands up on its end, that's that little teeny muscle that's being stimulated, and it pulls on the hair follicle, and the hair stands up a little bit. It pops up. And that's the same type of reaction we see when someone gets, or an animal gets its fight or flight response. They turn to fight. They have these little hair follicles or muscles are stimulated, and their hair puffs out. That makes them look a bit larger. And it's a response they have to make them look a little bit larger, a little more fierce to a predator. But in our case, that may or may not happen. We get excited sometimes, and those little things get fired off through a hormonal response, and it just triggers them to move. And sometimes, when we get what we call goosebumps, we get cold and a little bumps up on our arms, and those little hair follicles will also stand up. But this hair follicle is lined with epithelial tissue from this layer up here, and that's very important and very, very necessary thing, as we will find out in case someone is injured. So this epithelial layer actually goes kind of deep, only around those hair follicles, and then comes back out more to the surface. So this is very important. So if we have someone who's been injured and had a burn, for example, the skin's going to be damaged through having a burn. And what's great about this is that if we do a skin graft, and sometimes this area might be burned down to here, but there's still some epithelial tissue here. Well, there's a lot of growth that comes out of this layer, and we will start producing more skin cells, and this area would fill in that got burned. And or if we do a skin graft, for someone who has a large burn, they'll come to an area where, say, they'll take the inside of, actually they usually do it on the leg, they'll take a skin off of that and graft it onto the site, and they'll dig deep enough to get this epithelial layer, and they'll plant that on top of where the injury was, and the new cells will start growing, and that will fill in and heal the wound. Okay, we're going to go back up to the outer layer here, in the epidermis layer, what we show in red, and we're going to look at, this has several layers in it as well. And the deepest is called the stratum basal, and that's what's going to be right along this undulating ridge here. That's where you're going to find the stratum basal, and it's one-celled thick, and it reproduces through mitosis, as we've studied that in the past, and it's continually reproducing new cells. And it's going to, as these new cells are being produced here, and remember, they don't have their own blood supply, and they're getting their nutrition through the dermis layer, then they start pushing, as they multiply, they're pushing these layers farther and further up and towards the surface of the skin. But this is our baseline. Stratum means a level, and basal means the base level. The next layer up from that, and if you want to turn in your books, I think they have that. Not sure they have actually those layers. They somewhat have them in figure 3-4. If you would turn to that in your book, you can look at that layer there, and not really labeled in figure 3-3. But if you do have your anatomy coloring book that we recommend that you have with the course, you can look up the layer on the integumentary system, and depending on which year you got your book, this is on page 19, but it's going to be about in that layer, assuming that area, and it has them labeled here in the coloring book, so you will have that, and also when you color and fill those in, you'll get a better idea where those layers are. But the next layer out from the base layer, is called the stratum spinosum. And this area also undergoes a lot of mitosis, and it is several cells thick. And in this area, or this stratum, we find melon. And it's produced in these two layers by what we call melanocytes. So we're going to find melanocytes in this stratum spinosum and some in the stratum basal area as well. And what the melanin is, it's a brown pigment in our skin, and that's going to help protect us from some ultraviolet rays. And that's why when we out in the sun quite a bit, our skin turns brown, or it tans, that we call it. And that's the melanin being produced in the cells. And then if you're taken away from the light or sunlight for a long period of time, your skin lightens up; it gets lighter. And then for people of what we call a different color or brown skin, blacks or Asians, their skin is darker brown typically, and there's just more melanin in their skin naturally, and it's there for God's reason for protecting when they're more in a more arid and hot environments. They might need more protection from the direct rays of the sun. So, but not everybody has melanin. There are people called albinos, and they do not. So they're always very light skinned and they can get damaged by the sun, ultraviolet rays very easily. But there's three types of cancer that seem to show up in these areas. And the first one I want to tell you about is called a melanoma. And this is excessive or uncontrolled mitosis of the melanocytes. Now we talked about the melanins, they what produce the melanocytes do. And when we actually look at a cancer, it's just an overproduction of cells that shouldn't be being produced. The cells, it's basically it's out of control cell reproduction. So when we have a melanoma, it's the melanin that is being overproduced, and it's going to build up and cause problems in that area. And then the next would be what we call a basal cell carcinoma. So that obviously would be from this basal cells right along this area here. We will have an uncontrolled mitosis of the basal cells. So we name it by that. It's called a basal cell carcinoma. And then we have a squamous cell carcinoma, which is uncontrolled mitosis of the stratum spinosum. So in this next little layer right through here, and that's where that's going to happen. But it's all three are right in that same generalized area. Well, the next layer, as we move away to the surface of the skin, is called the stratum granulosum. And this area will overproduce a substance called keratin, and it does this on purpose, and it's not like it's uncontrolled, it's supposed to. And this is a protein that's going to kill the cells in that area. So as we move out here, when we get to this area, the stratum granulosum, keratin is produced, and it starts to kill off the cells. And there's a real neat purpose for that, and this forms a barrier, a waterproof barrier, so that water and outside things cannot penetrate the skin. So this is a very important thing that happens here to help protect us from disease and invaders into our skin. The next layer as we move out is called the stratum lucidum, and it is only found in the palms of our hands and the soles of our feet. And that's about all I'm going to say about those at this point. And then the very outer layer, as we get way out here, and this is the stratum corneum, and that is the most outer layer. And of course, the cells are keratinized because of the keratin that was produced. So these cells are dead, and they are flaking off. And we are constantly losing the cells on the outside of our skin because two things. As it gets out here, the cells are dead. They're no longer getting any nutrition, so they're going to flake off. And then as these cells get further away from this basal layer, once again, there's no nutrition coming to this area of the skin. The nutrition stops here, and it's through diffusion that we get the nutrition. The further away from that, it's not going to get as much nutrition, and the cells are going to die anyway. But it's interesting that as we get out to this outer layer here, we got about 25 to 30 layers of those dead squamous cells that are there flaking off. So I say 25 to 30 layers of that. So you can think the skin is not really thick in our terms of looking at it, but they do have distinct areas. Okay, we're going to move on just a little bit now to hair and our nails. Hair grows out of a hair follicle, as we have demonstrated here. We have a hair follicle, and hair grows out of that, and it's located in the dermis layer, right? The dermis layer, the hair follicle is located down here, and there's a hair shaft that's going to stick up above the surface of the skin, and then the root is going to be down below the surface. And at the base, that root is called a hair bulb. So right at the very bottom, it kind of bulbs out, and we call that the hair bulb. Okay. Now the root and the shaft, and they are made up of 3 layers of cells, and they are called. The center part of that is called the medulla, and it's made up of soft keratin type tissue. And then we have the cortex and the cuticle, and both of those have hard keratin tissue. Now, growth is going to occur at the hair bulb, which again is at the base of the hair follicle, and there is a blood supply to that. So the blood supply, we're going to do that in red here. It's going to come in, the little blood supply is going to come in and send a shoot up in through this area. And of course, if you have blood coming in, there's going to be an outgo, so there's going to be, we'll do that in blue, the vein and artery thing. There's going to be an outgoing vein, but red's going to be the artery coming in at the base there to give blood supply to this structure. All right. Right at the top of this this area here is where we have what we call the matrix of that, and it's made up of what we call undifferentiated cells. Now, if you remember back in biology, we talked about undifferentiated cells, and those are cells that have not been determined exactly what they're going to be yet. And the cell will, I just say it this way, but I kind of look at it this way to understand, it's going to make the decision of what it needs. So it's going to say, I need this kind of cell or that kind of cell. So it's going to be utilize that to determine whether it's going to be a medulla or if it's going to be a cortex or a cuticle. Got a question?
Are they similar to stem cells?
Yes, exactly. And I was just going to get to that, so I'm sure people have heard of that. So when we looked at stem cell research that's going on, we're taking undifferentiated cells, or cells that have not determined what they're going to be yet, and they're going to try to take those and put it into an area where there's a deficit of those type of cells. And hopefully by being there, they will become the cells that are needed by the body. So there's definitely a lot of research going on with that. And there is obviously a lot of success in that area too, trying to figure out what's going to work. And from research that I've seen, and I shouldn't say I've done a lot of research, but the articles, let's put it that way, that I've read, that taking your own undifferentiated cells and trying to put them in that area have been more successful than trying to take that from somewhere else and trying to implement those in there. And that's kind of real general, and don't take that to heart, because it's all kind of science that's constantly going on, and the more research that's done, obviously the better they can develop those and have a better understanding of what's going to go on with those stem cells. But that was an excellent question and a good lead-in to what I was going to say. So you're reading my mind out there. I like that. All right. So these cells, these undifferentiated cells, are going to become keratinized, and they're going to be hard or soft, depending on whether they need it as a medulla or a cortex or a cuticle, and it's going to be determined at that point. Now, a hair follicle goes through 2 different stages. One, there's a growth stage. That's where the hair grows, and it grows about a ½ an inch a month. And then at some point in time, it's going to determine that it needs to go through a rest phase or rest stage. And during the rest stage, there is no growth going on. So during this rest stage, the hair follicle is actually going to tighten down and squeeze that onto that hair and actually strangle it, if you will. It's a good way of thinking about it. And so once that rest stage ends, this relaxes, that hair is going to fall off. it dies. Well, the hair's already dead, but it dies at that point. It's not going to grow anymore. And then what starts happening is it starts growing another hair out of here. So that's why, your hair does fall out. Sometimes, you might break the ends and things like that, but your hair does actually fall out, and that's because it's gone through this rest stage, and it's to replenish the hair there. So it gets rid of some of it, and fortunately, it all doesn't happen at one time. So going bald all of a sudden, and then you have to grow new hair. So, but it goes through these two stages of that. Now, our nails are very similar to the hair follicle, where the setup is very, very similar, where we have a cuticle, a cortex, and medulla, and all that. But the interesting, and we also have the undifferentiated cells there. But unlike the hair, there's no rest phase. So your nails are constantly growing, and so that's why they need to be kept back. Well, I guess our hair actually needs to be cut too, but your nails need to be trimmed back because they will get in your way, and so they continue to grow. All right, what we're going to do next is move on to some glands that are in the skin. And again, if you have your coloring book, it has quite a few of them when we're looking at the skin. It has those pictured in your in the coloring book on page 18 and 19. Yeah, mostly on page 19, where they show a lot of different glands. So there are merocrine glands, which are in that dermal area. And an example of that would be a sweat gland. And that sweat glands we have in our body are used to cool the body. So we're giving out what we call perspiration, and then that evaporates on the skin and it helps to cool us down. Now remember from last chapter module 2, we talked about merocrine glands, cells, and these are glands that give off secrete a substance that have no cellular material in them. So like the sweat glands, it's just pure water, if you will, with some chemicals in there, but there's no cells. There's no cells actually coming out of that gland. And then we have sebaceous glands, which are an oil gland that's down in this area, and they secrete sebum, and they're located very close to the hair follicle, so that when the oil is secreted, it will follow up through the hair to get to the surface of the skin. Now, these types of cells, sebaceous glands, are holocrine glands, where actually there are cell material in that secretion, and the sweat glands or sebaceous glands, oil glands, do a number of things that helps to soften the skin. It will also help soften the hair a little bit, but it also helps when it gets on the skin, it helps to soften the skin. It also forms kind of a barrier on our skin so that bacteria from the outside doesn't adhere to the skin so well and take root to cause infection. But along with that, though, since they are holocrine glands and they secrete cells from inside the body out, there is cellular material there in the oil, and that also is a reason, and bacteria will grow on that, and that's another reason why, as we become teenagers, we have more activity of these sebaceous glands, and therefore, because the holocrine cells that are in there, we're more susceptible to having pimples and acne and things like that, because that is basically food for bacteria, and it will latch onto that and cause the breakouts that we get mainly through the teenage years, and after a while it kind of calms down as we get a little bit older. Okay. Now we're taking a shift now. That's kind of hitting the skin and those structures. So now we're going to shift focus here a little bit and move on to the skeletal system. And I'm just going to erase this off of here real quickly. And want to apologize that I don't have a skeleton today to help demonstrate this, but we will have it for some other future classes. So we're going to do our best to kind of look at the book, and as we go through some of the functions about the skeletal system, and also the coloring book has some very good illustrations of that. So in the coloring book, if you have that out, looking at page 20, and let's see, with our book here, and probably looking at figure 3.8, which is on or about page 78, depending on which biology book that you have here. All right, the skeletal system, obviously, excuse me, it gives us support. It allows us to be upright, and it provides protection for internal organs or for our brain. And obviously, because it gives some support and it's upright, we have muscles and we can have movement because of the skeletal system. Now, another thing that the skeletal system does is it stores chemicals. It's a chemical storage area for minerals such as calcium, magnesium, phosphorus, and it's also an area to store fat, believe it or not, in the yellow bone marrow of the long bones in our arms and legs is where we have this yellow bone marrow for storage of fat. And it also produces red and white blood cells. So the skeletal system does quite a bit. It's not just there for what we think of as bones and standing and movement, but a lot of nutritional factors are involved in this, and as a storage area. And then also a very important need for red and white blood cells to be produced, which we will study more about that later on when we get to that chapter as well. Hemopoiesis is the process of manufacturing blood cells, and this happens in the red bone marrow portion of the cell. Let's look at the bones here a little bit. Well, before we go on, let me tell you, the red bone marrow, we're going to find that, hang on for this alarm to go by. The red bone marrow, if you, by the way, I'm going to stop for a second, I'll back up one more thing. Another good thing to do is the next time you have chicken, hopefully you get a chicken leg, and you can use that long bone of the chicken leg to look at some of the structures of a long bone, which we're going to discuss here in a little bit. And you'll see some of the cartilage, and you can break that end of that bone open, because the very top of that bone, and I'm going to hold this up here. Hopefully we can see this a little bit on the camera. I know you have, since I don't have a bone to demonstrate, I'm not sure if this will show up very well. They're trying to focus on it. But up in this is a femur, the leg bone, the upper leg bone, or the thigh bone. And up at the top of that is where we would have the red blood cells being made up in the red bone marrow, which would be up in this area. And the yellow bone marrow would be more in the shaft of the bone, okay? And we're going to be looking at that a little bit more in just a few minutes. But next time you have a chicken, chickens are great for studying anatomy, but make sure you get the bones in the thigh and the leg where they come together, and clean that all off, and you'll see the cartilage there, and you'll be able to break the top of that cartilage off and actually see the end of the bone, and see it's kind of porous at that end. It's kind of not quite as dense, and that's where the red bone marrow would be produced. We have 5 categories of bones. We have long bones. Now, long bones is what it says. It is longer than it is wide. So the example of that obviously would be the upper arm, lower arm, the thighs, the lower leg. Actually, the digits in our fingers right through here, that would be longer than it is wide, so that would be considered a long bone as well, even though it's getting kind of small. But the definition is it's longer than it is wide. That's a long bone. A short bone would be a bone that's about the same width and length. So they're kind of almost square, or they're small and somewhat rounded or odd-shaped. And examples with that would be the bones in our wrist and the bones in our ankles. And those would be short bones. And also we have flat bones, and these are bones that are curved and kind of flat and thin. And obviously ribs would be an example of a flat bone. Also, some of the bones of the skull would be considered flat bones. We have what's called a sesamoid bone, and that would be a bone that is encased in a tendon. An example of that would be our patella, or what we commonly call our kneecap. And there's also a couple more at the base of your big toe. There's a couple of them there on the bottom of your foot. There's a couple of sesamoid bones there too. And then we have the irregular bones, and that would be anything else that doesn't fit in those categories. So vertebrae, your sacrum, those would be irregular bones. Okay, a long bone would have three major components. One is called a diaphysis, and this is basically the shaft or the long length of the bone here. This would be the diaphysis. It's made up of compact bone. It's dense. It's very hard in this area. And there's very, few and small spaces in that part of the bone there. It's very dense. Then next we have the epiphysis, and that would be the upper end of the bone here, or the lower end of the bone, where actually we might call that the area that comes close to articulating or joins another bone. And it is made up of what we call cancellous bone, or what sometimes we call it spongy bone, although it's not spongy and collapsing, but if you look at it, it looks more like a sponge. There's a lot of air space in there. And again, this is where we talked about the red bone marrow would be, and where we'd have the production of the red and white bones, blood cells, would be formed in this area. But it's very porous and looks like a sponge, but it's not soft at all. It's still very hard, but it lightens the bone a little bit too. All right. Then what we have is called a epiphyseal plate, and this is an area between the epiphysis and the diaphysis. So there's kind of a little line through there, and it's easier to see on young people who have not stopped growing yet. In this area is made up of hyaline cartilage, and the young people is anyway, and this is where our growth comes from. We're going to grow from that area. The length of the bone is going to get longer, and the epiphysis grows somewhat, but it doesn't grow a whole lot. But most of that growth is going to be below that growth plate. So once someone meets their full maturity of stop growing, this area here at the growth plate is going to start to ossify. And ossification means it just starts to harden. So growth is stopping at this point, and this little growth plate becomes a epiphyseal line. It's no longer an epiphyseal plate, but it's an epiphyseal line, and it just hardens, it becomes hard bone, and that's when we know someone has stopped growing, actually. So sometimes when you have people who are very short in stature, sometimes they don't know if they're going to grow late growers or, because, they kind of, everybody else is getting tall and they're not. So sometimes they go to the doctor because there are conditions that calcify this area a little too fast, and then that's your permanent height. So they can do some radiographs of the long bones plates in there, and they can actually say, oh, no, it still looks good. Looks like we're still going to get some growth. We don't know when, but it still looks like it's going to grow some. But once that area starts to ossify or calcify, then no more growth will happen there. All right, then on the end of the bone, on all the ends of all the bones, there's what we call the articular cartilage. And it's made up of hyaline cartilage, and it covers the end of the bone of the joint, and it's very thick in adults, a little thicker than it is in children. And again, when you get your chicken bone out there, you'll find it's kind of a whitish, very smooth, dense substance, and that is going to be your articular cartilage. And that can actually, on the chicken bone, you can pop that thing right off, and you can see the cancellous bone below that. All right, in the diaphysis region, and again, that is the long part of the bone, the diaphysis region, there's a cavity in there. It's called the medullary cavity, and in young people it contains red bone marrow. But this changes to yellow bone marrow as we get older, and it is, again, an area of storage for fat that the body may need as a reserve. Now, granted, it's not a large area of storage, but it is an area where that does happen. And the bone is covered by sheets of periosteum, and the prefix peri means around. So every time you hear pericardium around the heart, periosteum would be around the bone. There are two layers there. There's an outer layer that is very dense, irregular, connective tissue, and there's where we contain our blood supply and nerve supply to the bone itself. And then we have the inner layer of that, and it's a single layer of bone cells. And that's basically the two layers of the bone. Now we're actually going to look at some bones themselves and finish up with that. And we kind of break these down into different sections here. There are about 206 bones in the body, and we're not going to learn them all, but we're going to learn most of them. And most of them you probably have just learned, as time has gone on, but we're going to look at these and just state where they are and give them their names. We break the skeleton up into two sections: the axial skeleton, which is basically the trunk, the neck, and the head, and then we have the appendages, which would be the arms and the legs. The axial skeleton predominantly gives protection to the organs and the brain, and gives support so that our appendages can move off of that base of support. Okay, we're going to start with the pectoral girdle and list the bones that are in that. The first one we're talking about is the clavicle, and that is what we typically call our collarbone. So it goes from the shoulder over to the sternum here, and you can feel that on yourselves, and it's a long, thin bone. And it attaches, and in fact, what's interesting about the clavicle to me, it's the only place that attaches structurally by the skeleton, the arm to the trunk. So it's all held on by that one little bone going across there, and then of course the muscles around that attach to it and keep it in support so it doesn't just drop off. But it's only attached in one spot. Your whole arm is only attached in one little teeny joint. So we have the clavicle, then we have the scapula, or what we call our shoulder blade. So that would be on our back here. We have the humerus, which is the long bone of the upper arm, the humerus. And a lot of times when we hit our elbow, when we hit that elbow, and we see people say, I hit my funny bone. They say funny bone for two reasons. One, because the upper arm bone is called the humerus, and the other is you don't know what to do, cry or laugh, because it hurts so badly. It's kind of a weird feeling. I know most everybody's had that. And what happens there is actually what you're hitting is a nerve. Is the ulnar nerve cuts underneath the bottom of the humerus there. It's actually called an epicondyle. It goes up under there, and what has happened is you've actually hit that nerve and you pinched it against the bone, and that's why it sends your hand numb immediately, because you've just traumatized that nerve, and it's a horrible feeling, and I'm sure most of you have had it. So the humerus, upper arm bone, and then we have in the forearm the radius and the ulna. The ulna would be on the little finger side and attaches up here to at the elbow, and then the radius would be on the thumb side. And it's actually the radius that allows you to do this motion. The radius rolls over the ulna. At the head of it, it's got a round head, and it will actually rotate and so forth. So to know where it is, no matter which way your hand is pointing, the radius is always on the thumb side, the ulna is on the little finger side. Then next, in the wrist, we have carpals. There are 8 little bones in your wrist, and they're called carpals. Each one of them has a name, and we're not going to go into those. And then what we have next in our hand would be metacarpals. So carpals, metacarpals. And there are 5 of those, one for each finger and one for the thumb. And they are long bones, so they run the length of your palm of your hand and through here on your thumb. And then at the end, what we call our fingers, they are called phalanges, and there's 14 of those. There's 3 in each of your fingers, and there's 2 bones and your thumb. So you have 14 phalanges. So we have humerus, ulna, radius, 8 carpal bones, 5 metacarpals, and 14 phalanges. Okay? And then as we moved up, so we named those, renamed those, we have, where did I leave off? Okay, we have a clavicle, or collarbone, but clavicle is what we want to call it, and scapula is our shoulder blade. And so those are the bones of the pectoral girdle. Next, we have the pelvic girdle. And on that, we have the sacrum, which is really at the very bottom of your spinal cord, but it is a bone separate in itself. And it's kind of a V-shaped thing. Let's go ahead and draw you a picture of that. It's kind of, well, that'll work probably. And it's kind of almost like a, well, more like a triangle, but it's kind of a wedge-shaped bone. And on that rests our, down here at the very bottom then, we have the sacrum, and then we've got a little bone right down here at the bottom. It's called the coccyx. And that makes up the base, the very bottom of our spine as we come up here with our vertebrae, which we'll get to in a minute, and they start stacking up. Okay, off of the sacrum, we have what's called the coxa. That's really made up of 3 bones. That would be the ilium, so that gives us our wing out here. I'm a lousy artist, sorry. But this is our ilium out here. And then we have the pubic bone, and we have the ischial. Oops, H-E-A-L. Ischial bone. And ischial bones are really what you sit on. Did I spell that wrong? I-E-L? And, whoops, I lost my mic. Hope that hadn't been down there for too long. Excuse me a second while I put this back on. I may have popped that out earlier. But the coxa is made up of the ilium, the pubic bone, and the ischial bone. And then we have the femur, which attaches. I'm going to draw another wing over here, and then we have the femur. Actually, this comes up more like this. That attaches up here into the ilium. So that's your thigh bone, is the femur. And then down from that, we have the patella, which is the kneecap. Then below that, we have the tibia and the fibula. So those are the 2 bones that are in the lower part of your leg, from your knee down to your foot or ankle. Right down the middle of that, which would be the larger bone, is called the tibia, and that's where our shin is part of the tibia. And then we have the fibula, which is a long, thin bone that runs down the side of the tibia. And then we have bones of the foot. And it's like in the wrist, we had carpals, but in the foot, what we call the ankle bones are called tarsals. And then the long bones that come off of that go down in your foot are called the metatarsals. So in the wrist, we had carpals, metacarpals, and in the foot, we have tarsals and metatarsals. And then, of course, down at the toes, again, we have phalanges. So they call the same thing as your fingers. So that makes it a little bit easy to remember. And again, there's 14 of those. There's 14 phalanges on your toes, just like there are 14 phalange bones of the fingers. So to recap, we have a sacrum and a coccyx, a coxa, which is made up of the ilium, the pubic, and the ischial. We have a femur. We have a kneecap, or patella is a scientific name. We have the tibia and fibula. Then we have the 7 tarsals, 5 metatarsals, and then 14 phalanges. Now the difference between the hand and the foot there, in the hand we had 8 carpal bones, in the foot we have 7 tarsal bones. So the numbers don't quite even out, but they do have different names. Okay, we're about done here. We're coming up to next would be the bones of the skull. And we're going to go through those fairly fast here. Let's see if we can have a good picture. Yeah, if you look in your book on around page 84, it's going to be figure 312, and it has a good view of the bones of the skull. There's quite a few bones in the skull. We have one frontal bone. So as it says, it's named for where it is. That's a frontal bone. We have 2 parietal bones. Those would be bones on kind of the back side of the skull, one on each side. We have an occipital bone, and that will be in the back of the skull. We have 2 temporal bones, one on each side. It's right above your ear is where our temporal bone is. We have 2 sphenoid bones. One's on this side, one's side. Just in front of the temporal bones, we have 2 sphenoid bones. We have 2 zygomatic bones, and those what we call make up our cheekbones here. Actually, there's a little arch because there's a hallway in there for muscles to attach, and this is a zygomatic bone. We have 1 maxilla, and that is the bone where our upper teeth go into. It's attached to the skull here. We have 1 mandible, and that's our jaw, what we call our jawbone that moves up and down. So a maxilla and mandible. We have a nasal bone, so it's straight in here where the bridge of our nose is. We have 2 lacrimal bones, and those are actually inside the orbit of the eye socket. They're very small bones in there. We have 2 ethmoid bones in there, and we have a palatine bone, which would be up inside of our mouth, and then we have a vomer, which is a very tiny little bone, right basically at the base of your nose, but just directly back from there is attached to the maxilla. Okay, so I'm going to go through those real fast. Frontal bone, parietal bones, occipital bones, temporal bones, ethmoid bones. Did I say ethmoid? I meant sphenoid. I'd say that both times.
You said sphenoid first, and then
Okay. Okay, thank you for correcting me. Sometimes you get these things mixed up. Sphenoid bones, zygomatic bones. We have a maxilla. We have a mandible. We have a nasal bone, bridge of the nose. Lacrimal bones in the eye. Ethmoid, those are the ones that are in there. Parietal bone would be up in the mouth, and then the vomer would be right at the base of the nose, but in there deep. Okay, now we're going to look at the vertebrae real quickly. These are, again, irregular bones, and we have 7 cervical vertebrae. Those would be the vertebrae that are in our neck. Cervical is another word for neck. We have 7 of those. The first 2 have names, and then the rest of them are just numbered by where they are. So number 1 and number 2 have names, but they're still called 1 and 2. So we have the atlas and the axis. The atlas is number 1, the first cervical bone, and the axis is the second cervical vertebrae. And then the rest of them from now, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 are all just numbered. And you can find and actually feel those if you go to the back of your neck and kind of bend your head forward a little bit. And the first really big lump that you feel there, the bone, that's your 7th cervical vertebrae. And then you can actually count the bumps as you go up to a certain point. And then it gets kind of hard because your musculature gets in the way there. But you can actually palpate that on some people very easily. And of course, the thicker somebody's neck is the harder it is to palpate or feel. But that's just like a bony landmark. So you kind of decide where are you. Then we have under the cervical, we have the thoracic vertebrae, and there are 12 of those. And these are distinct because ribs come off of the thoracic vertebrae. We do not have ribs on the cervical or the lumbar, and there are 5 lumbar vertebrae as well. Now this is a norm. Now there are anomalies. There are some people that have 8 cervical vertebrae, and there are some people that have 6 lumbar vertebrae, but they still have all the others at the right number. But those are 2 areas where you typically get a little what we call an anomaly, where you have an extra vertebrae. And so anyway, that's just what happens sometimes. Now the ribs, as we said, they're connected to the thoracic vertebrae, and but we have those are kind of broken up into different sections as well. Now what we call a true rib is where the rib is attached to the vertebrae and it comes around and attaches to the sternum, the bone that's right here, which we haven't actually named yet. And the ones that attach directly to the sternum are called true ribs, and there are 7 pairs of those. And then the next 3 ribs are called false ribs. Now they are also connected to the sternum, but they're connected by a long strand of cartilage. So they're actually attached to the cartilage from the ribs above that, from rib number 7. And then we have 2 floating ribs that aren't attached to the sternum at all, and that's why they're called floating. They're just out there. And those are the last 2 ribs that you have. All right, so we have 12 thoracic vertebrae with 12 ribs on each side. Then the sternum is the last bony structure we're going to look at. At the top of the sternum is a little kind of it's almost square, cuboidal shaped part of that sternum that's called manubrium, and that's where the clavicle or the collarbone comes in and attaches. Then we have the body of the sternum where most of the ribs come in and attach, and then at the very end of that we have what's called a xiphoid process. It's a little projection, a very pointed projection of the bottom of the sternum. Okay, the last thing I want to review with you is actually some structural things, and there's only a few of these here. When we hear the word meatus, it is basically a passageway, is what we call a passageway. And example of that would be our ear. We have a hole going through the bone so that we can have sound that travels into the inner part of our, what we call our inner ear, which is up in the skull, and that's called a meatus. And actually that name for that hole there is called the external auditory for sound, meatus. So it's a passageway for sound to travel through. And then next we have things that are called processes, and those are basically projections off the bone. Like on our vertebrae, we have the body of it, and then we have what we call the spinous process that comes off of that. So if we look at it from the side, it's kind of shaped like this, and we have this would be the spinous process, and that's what we feel when we feel down somebody's back. We actually feel the spinous processes. And then also we have, if you look at it from, oh boy, this is going to be bad. We have kind of looking at the bone from the back going forward. This would be the spinous process, this is here. But we have these 2 little wings go off to the side where the ribs actually attach. So the rib would actually be attaching here and here as the rib comes around and attaches to the sternum, which would be up here. So this is a transverse process, and we have 2 attachments here for the rib to come around, and then that would attach up here to the sternum, as you're kind of looking at from the back forward. So a process is something that's a little projection off of the bone. We have sutures, which are basically junctures of 2 flat bones. So as the skull comes together, all those bones that we talked about in the skull, they are connected by a suture, and the suture would be a very let's let's look at this from the side. Let's say this is our skull. Kind of here, this would be the frontal bone. And our temporal bone would be here. So we would have a temporal bone. That's not showing up very well, is it? That's not either. Let's try the black one. Very good. Temporal bone, occipital, and parietal would be here. So each of these little red squiggly lines, and they are squiggly for a reason, and that gives a lot of strength and structure as the bones, basically, if you look at this, they interact, then that's going to be a very tight structure, and they call that a suture, where those two bones come together. And so there's very little to no movement. Actually, they say they're fused, but they aren't really fused. Some people in the medical profession say they are, but there really is some movement there. Because anyway, that's just the way it is. There is very slight movement, though. There's not a lot of movement, because we don't need a lot of movement going on in our head. We need that to be very secure, to be protected. And then we have what's called a foramen or a hole. So that is another term that you could hear out there, is something that's called a foramen. Would be basically a large hole. Okay, so that's the end of chapter module 3, and we've covered bones, quite a few of them, fairly quickly, and looked at the skin and integumentary system. Okay, well, thank you all very much, and look forward to seeing you next week.